This is Kaliningrad, approximately 400 kilometers to the west of the Russian mainland. It's a Russian outpost of pivotal strategic importance. Situated between Lithuania and Poland, and divided from the rest of Russian territory by NATO allied nations, Kaliningrad is a small outcropping of land, easy to miss on the map, but with a few scary tricks up its sleeve. By air, Kaliningrad is close enough to launch nuclear missiles that could quickly reach the capital of every country on the European continent. By sea, Kaliningrad hosts Russia's Baltic Fleet, due to its holding of Russia's only year-round ice-free port on the Baltic Sea. And by land, Kaliningrad holds the keys to one of Russia's primary anti-NATO strategies, something which has played a major role in preventing NATO from fully responding to Russia's geopolitical moves for several decades, including, but not limited to, Russia's several invasions of Ukraine. In some ways, Kaliningrad is, or at least has long been, the ultimate strategic position for Russia. But these days, that strategic position is becoming potentially bad news for them, increasingly less of an asset and more of a liability. And there is a growing threat that Russia could lose this exclave forever, due in part to the way they've overextended themselves in Ukraine, and also due in part to internal separatist movements that Russia has tried to suppress, but that have become emboldened by the hardships of war, with fears that were once mere murmurs, quickly turning into very loud voices. Right now in Kaliningrad, there is a rapidly growing movement known as the Baltic Republican Party, a separatist group whose leader has recently stated that he believes the moment has come for the region to declare its independence from Russia and side with Europe against Putin. And he's not alone. A recent referendum covering 1/5 of the residents living within the Kaliningrad Oblast had 72% of the participating voters express a desire to leave Russia. And while this doesn't mean that 72% of all the people within Kaliningrad want to secede, since those who participated in this referendum may already have been more inclined in a separatist direction, it still demonstrates that, for Vladimir Putin, there are a worryingly large number of the 500,000 or so Russians within the region that aren't as loyal to him as he may like to believe. So much so that nearly 70,000 of them were willing to go so far as to risk their lives and their freedom by putting their names on a ballot to secede from the nation in the middle of an active war. Many more separatists are almost certainly hiding behind the curtains, and the growing tensions have made Russia very nervous, to say the least, with predictable crackdowns on journalists, and those expressing views contrary to the Kremlin's wishes often being arrested and labeled as foreign agents. But as these internal forces continue to grow, at the same time as new external forces come to bear against Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine, it's becoming increasingly possible that Russia could lose Kaliningrad in our lifetimes, or even sooner than we think. If that happens, it will certainly shape Russia's future. And not just Russia's future, but the future of Europe, America, and many other far-reaching corners of the world. But to really understand the full scale of that impact, you first need to understand how Kaliningrad has shaped Russia's recent past. It's a side of the war in Ukraine that most people haven't seen, far from the front lines, but a side that could, eventually, become the most impactful front of them all. To explain it all, we have to go back to the beginning. Just 70 days following its invasion of Ukraine, Russia found itself in dire need of the Kaliningrad exclave. What had initially been planned as a brief blitzkrieg attack had failed, and Russia's frontline troops, which had expected a quick knockout victory, had instead found themselves in full retreat in several key regions, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy, with other regions at major risk, since Russia had not yet had time to build sufficient fortifications to sustain itself against the large, rapid counteroffensive. At this point, Russia faced a very major threat. If other European nations made the decision to retaliate in a meaningful way while Russia was still vulnerable and on its back foot, the entire situation could crumble in a matter of days or weeks, and the Ukraine invasion misadventure would land itself as a brief, embarrassing blot on the Russian record. As the United States and Europe watched the situation on the ground and debated what to do, Russia wasted no time, and turned to what was perhaps the strongest weapon in their anti-NATO arsenal: Kaliningrad. A weapon they had used over the decades to pacify European and American resistance as Russia carried out their expansionist plans to reconquer pieces of the old Soviet Union. This weapon was in and of itself part of the old Soviet Union, and had long allowed Russia to defeat NATO in the only way they knew how, by convincing them to stay out of the fight. In May of 2022, with its army close to full retreat, Russia conducted a provocative military exercise from the Kaliningrad exclave, simulating a situation where they would fire nuclear rockets all across Europe, using some of the same ballistic missile systems that were being used against Ukraine, and showing that, as long as Russia controlled Kaliningrad, NATO was well within range. This came in concert with foreboding threats from the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin had said just a few days earlier that if anyone intended to intervene from the outside, they should know that Russia's retaliatory strikes would be lightning fast, that Russia had the tools they needed for this and would use them if necessary. The message was clear. NATO had better not intervene against Russia's retreating troops, or else nukes from Kaliningrad. But while these big words might have sounded scary to the untrained ear, one needs to consider that the real goal of these nuclear exercises was probably different than what might first appear on the surface. A well-kept secret about nuclear saber-rattling is that nuclear threats are not generally done to scare national leaders or military forces, at least not directly, but rather to scare the civilian populations of an opposing nation into apathy. Because, while it's sad to say, most politicians fear being voted out by a scared populace far more than they fear the use of a nuclear missile against some distant city they aren't connected to, especially since the nuclear scenario isn't at all likely, while potentially getting voted out of office is. Nuclear threats are a way to feed talking points to the media of your opponents, and to get people to write letters to their congressmen, so to speak. As such, they play an effective role in influencing long-term political decisions, especially around election seasons, where the goal is to get someone in office who the opposing nation feels is a stronger leader against nuclear threats, but whose foreign policy may actually be more in your favor. Someone who is willing to appease you to remove fear from their constituents, rather than holding you accountable and calling your bluff, for example. But in situations where the rubber meets the road, and national leaders are facing an immediate on-the-ground crisis, or a critically important threat, nuclear saber-rattling wouldn't be expected to be nearly as impactful. That's because people in decision-making positions are already well aware of the nuclear threat and have already calculated it into their strategies, so nuclear saber-rattling doesn't add any new information. Plus, these leaders have also seen countless examples of nuclear saber-rattling in the past, seemingly every week from nations like North Korea, or previously when the West fought in on-the-ground proxy wars against the Soviet Union. But in spite of all of these threats, nothing has ever happened. This makes experienced leaders generally dispositioned to understand better than most that nuclear threats are almost certainly not real. And when weighing the near certainty of a geopolitical loss, such as ceding Ukraine to Russia, against the very, very low probability of real nuclear retaliation in response to their intervention, most leaders would move to take their chances and avoid the near certain loss. At least, this is certainly what has always been done in the past. For example, right or wrong, the West took its chances with nuclear warfare by intervening in Russia's efforts to influence Korea and Vietnam. And Russia didn't respond with nukes then, even under the leadership of some of the most bloodthirsty despots in human history, such as Joseph Stalin during the Korean War, a man who had more than 1 million of his own citizens executed, but still wasn't willing to use nukes against the United States. So if Russia wasn't willing to use nukes when the US intervened in their affairs then, they would not be at all likely to respond with nuclear warfare now if the West engaged in similar intervention in Ukraine. People afraid of Russia's nukes due to the Ukraine conflict simply forget that this is not by any means the first time the West has engaged in an armed conflict with a nuclear-armed Russian state. For these reasons, and more, nuclear saber-rattling on its own gives leaders no reason to do anything differently than they already are. Or in other words, no reason to stop an attack that they may already be inclined to pursue, such as, in our example, a potential reinforcement of Ukraine against a retreating Russian army, which Putin was genuinely worried about. But if even your nuclear threats aren't enough, what's a raging despot supposed to do to hold back his potential enemies? In this case, if he really wanted to deter NATO, Putin had to go beyond a nuclear threat, to include something more realistic that would be taken more seriously by the real decision makers, even if it went unnoticed by the media headlines. To do so, Putin chose to threaten the West with a type of weapon that he had already recently used, rather than one he would only use in theory. If nukes could scare Western populations, Great, but to give immediate pause to Western leaders, he would focus not on the nuclear drills alone, but also on the drill's location. The goal was to remind Western leaders, not primarily about the fact that Russia had nukes, but rather about the fact that Russia had Kaliningrad. For seasoned military commanders, the Kaliningrad reminder was something that was much more impactful than the nuclear threat, because nobody ever has forgotten that Russia has nukes, but many people routinely forget, underestimate, or don't even know in the first place the strategic importance of Russia's Baltic Sea exclave. Kaliningrad itself is strategic, not primarily because of the nuclear missiles, but instead because of something called the Suwalki Gap, which, according to many military analysts, is by far NATO's weakest point, and has even been called the single deadliest place on the planet. The Suwalki Gap refers to the small strip of land on the Polish and Lithuanian border separating Russian Kaliningrad from Belarus. This is a mere 70-kilometer strip that is bordered by Russia and Russia's closest ally, and its danger should not be understated. In the event that Russia ever engaged in an armed conflict with NATO, passing this stretch of land would be required for Western ground troops to reinforce the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia from a Russian invasion, something they would be required to do based on their Article 5 commitments. But doing so would be the definition of a meat grinder, because the entire strip of land could be heavily fortified by Russia in a short amount of time, and easily reached by artillery and missiles coming from both Russian and Belarusian territory, not to mention the possibility of close air support from both sides. The casualties in such an area would be catastrophic and almost beyond estimation. Some war games have shown scenarios where more than 60,000 NATO troops could die on just the first day of fighting for the Suwalki Gap, with half of the participating forces on both sides being lost within the first 72 hours. These are losses on par with some of the deadliest battles of World War I and World War II. Losses that are probably too high to be tolerated by modern societies with access to high-definition, instant media that would show everyone back home the true horrors of the battlefield, which were largely hidden from civilians in previous wars. The alternative would be to send airlifts and naval convoys into the Baltic states. But since at the time of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Finland was not yet a NATO member state, naval and air approaches could face a similar problem, forced to travel within range of Kaliningrad's missile batteries and anti-aircraft systems to break through into Lithuania. It's something known as an A2, AD, or anti-access area denial bubble. Basically, Kaliningrad is a fortress, not one which could defeat NATO long-term, but which could make a war between NATO and Russia very costly. Far more costly than most Western politicians are prepared to risk, and more costly than Western populations are prepared to tolerate. On the other hand, Russia, for its part, has shown an extreme willingness to use its people's lives unsparingly, giving them a major strategic advantage in using the region. And as long as Russia was willing to spend lives, and the West was hesitant, Kaliningrad served as a stopping function to prevent NATO from getting involved. Going back to the wargaming exercises, numerous wargames have shown this exact scenario, with the potential for a quick Russian invasion of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, former members of the Soviet Union, and Russia then being able to use the Suwalki Gap to hold NATO at bay and force them into a bloody conflict. One in which Russia would gamble that NATO would simply choose not to respond, and not to uphold their Article 5 commitments, similar to the way that NATO had failed to respond when Russia had conquered Crimea, though with the key difference that Ukraine was not a NATO member state, and the Baltics are. Speaking of Crimea, the scariest part about these wargame scenarios was that, in contrast to nuclear threats, recent Russian politics had shown their willingness to actually do exactly this sort of thing. Many other former Soviet states had been invaded since Vladimir Putin had come into power, such as Georgia and Ukraine, twice. So in this instance, Russia couldn't be pushed aside as mere bluff and bluster, no matter how insane the plan might seem. What's more, in the Suwalki Gap, Russia had something that they did not have on the Ukrainian front: decades to prepare. The area around the Suwalki Gap was already well fortified, and it would not be a stretch for Russia to reinforce this 70-kilometer corridor, something far easier than the task that lay in front of them to fortify the nearly 1,000 kilometers along the Ukrainian front. The threat was obvious to the military strategists who understood Russia best. By conducting nuclear drills in Kaliningrad while their invading troops were exposed and in retreat, Russia was basically saying, if you respond to our actions in Ukraine by sending in troops, or more weapons than we think are allowable, and pressure us more than we can manage in Ukraine, we can respond in kind by invading the Baltic states, and creating a new front line where we have a stronger advantage, and it will be a very bloody war for you to break through the Suwalki Gap. Could NATO win? Probably. But their people were likely to tire of the war before the Russian leaders tired of sending men in to die, as has long been Russia's favorite national strategy. It was a good gamble for NATO, but a gamble nonetheless. NATO balked, and for Russia, the threat worked. For this reason and others, NATO failed to send adequate equipment to Ukraine in a timely fashion. This gave Russia the time it needed to perform a strategic retreat and reinforce its defenses in Ukraine along the front line that we now have today. Kaliningrad proved that it still had the power to help Russia dictate geopolitics and conquer unwilling people without meaningful consequences. By letting them do this, it was a significant loss for NATO. But as we said at the beginning of this video, things have recently begun to change. As of this video's posting date, it has now been over a year and a half since these events, and Kaliningrad, which was only just recently a strategic windfall for Russia, is now on a downward spiral to become nothing but an expensive liability. In fact, it may already be there. We've already mentioned the internal separatist movements, and the fact that at least a fifth, and likely more than half of Kaliningrad's citizens, are potentially willing to secede from Russia if given the choice. But there is one final piece to this puzzle that makes Kaliningrad, and the Suwalki Gap, not quite the threat it was just 1 year ago, significantly crippling Russia's ability to continue to influence the West. That piece is the accession of Finland, and potentially Sweden, into NATO. With these two nations that border the Baltic Sea joining the alliance, and officially becoming allied to Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, Russia's ability to create a chokehold for NATO at the Suwalki Gap has now diminished from close to a near certainty to close to an impossibility. Rather than forcing men through the killing funnel, NATO now has the guaranteed right to sidestep the Suwalki Gap by deploying troops from the north, over the sea, or via the air, without the need to travel past Kaliningrad's missile batteries or anti-air defense systems. This change has altered the calculus behind Kaliningrad's viability as a strategic position beyond recognition. So much so that the French Institute of International Relations recently issued a report saying, with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, the Baltic theater is reconfigured so profoundly to Russia's disadvantage that no amount of effort could make Fortress Kaliningrad defensible. Not only that, but this move has effectively made Russia's Baltic fleet, stationed in Kaliningrad, strategically unimportant, with almost no point other than to defend Kaliningrad. But since Kaliningrad itself has now become strategically unimportant without the Suwalki Gap, that task turns the fleet into something that is no longer an asset, but an expensive liability, with not enough upside to truly justify its existence. And with these changes, effectively, a potential Russian attack on Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia, always a risky move, is now far more risky for Russia than it's worth. Kaliningrad, what used to be a way for Russia to portray force, is now a liability, completely surrounded by NATO, and something that itself must now be protected by a spread-thin Russian military. In fact, rather than creating a strategic chokehold where Russia can concentrate its forces, and therefore need less of them to be effective, Kaliningrad now contributes to the sheer massive territory that must be defended by an already crumbling Russian military. What's more, with NATO's control over the Baltic Sea, and the territory between Russia and Kaliningrad, they have the ability to completely cut the exclave off from Russian supply lines. With all these changes in mind, Russia now has almost no strategic incentive to continue to defend Kaliningrad long term. And this is something they themselves may have already acknowledged by starting to move critical military supplies out of Kaliningrad and repositioning them on the front line of Ukraine. This could perhaps be seen as a good move to help Russia win the war in Ukraine, but it's not a good move if you actually believe Russia's talking points. where they have said repeatedly that the reason they invaded Ukraine was to protect themselves from NATO encroachment. But Kaliningrad was a lot more strategic for that than Ukraine will ever be for this purpose. So abandoning positions in Kaliningrad in favor of Ukraine shows that Russia is very desperate, or lying, or both. My money is on both. In the coming years, considering all of these external pressures and the growing internal separatist movement, there is a very real reason for Russia to do the math and decide that keeping Kaliningrad is no longer worth the cost. But if Russia decides Kaliningrad is no longer worth it, what happens next? The specifics of how separation would happen are difficult to predict, but I'll cover such things in the future if and when they develop. So be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you're interested in that. Kaliningrad could become a piece of Poland, or Lithuania, or it could become independent, or it could remain Russian and become an expensive liability on their already stretched balance sheets. It's hard to say either way, but one thing is certain. Kaliningrad can never be used again to threaten NATO to the degree it was at the start of the invasion of Ukraine. And that is bad news for Russia when it comes to its ability to influence NATO away from intervening in foreign conflicts. For that reason alone, even if it wins the war in Ukraine, Russia has already lost the larger geopolitical chess match due to its strategic failures, which crumbled its ability to defend the territory and emboldened Finland and Sweden to tip over the edge and join the NATO alliance. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. This episode was made possible by my Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members, who continue to support my work and make it possible for me to fund the editing and animation behind these videos. If that sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, I'm deeply appreciative. You can learn more by clicking the membership tab on my main channel page, or by following the link to Patreon in the description. Thanks for helping to make this channel possible. And of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that this video can reach even more people.